Welcome back, everybody, to me talking calmly about a subject that I care about deeply. Nope, this is not me doing the video I wanted to do today, which was talk about sexism in Wheel of Time. That one's gonna come real soon. I just felt an urgent need to talk about something else, and that is Grimdark. Yes, again. And I first went and raged a ton, and then I got back and did some thinking, and I'm going to do a calm explanation of my issues with Grimdark. And I want to, choose another one of my Patreon backers to cheer to today, and it's going to be my good friend, master of thumbnails, brother of long drinking nights, and all these other things, my good friend, John. This one's for you, man. Well, cheers. And if you want to be, cheered to, even force me to drink a beer of your choice, you can become a Patreon backer. If you don't want to do that, that's totally fine. You're not missing out on anything but my pain if I drink horrible beer, basically. And even that will be captured on video anyway, so maybe someone else is doing it for you. Anyway, let's go back and talk about Grimdark. So today I was doing what I was supposed to do, and that is obviously work for my record label and do important things. So, obviously, the first step was to go and procrastinate because, anxiety was preventing me from answering emails and stuff, so I did that instead. I looked at booktube stuff. And I first watched Steve Talks Books video on What is Grimdark, and then I went and watched Jolene's on What is Grimdark. And I'll link them both down below, and, well, I got very, very angry, and then I recorded a 15-minute video of me yelling at people. And then I actually sat down and decided to do some research, by which I mean I reread a bunch of articles I read back in the day in 2013, and that I referenced in my angry video. And I actually went back and reread them again and thought some more about this stuff, and my arguments still stand, but I'll try to explain them in a calm and systematic way, which frightens me because that's not my style. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this. I'll be more than willing to talk and argue with all of you in the comments or like in a video discussion or whatever. I think we need to stop talking about Grimdark because Grimdark is dead. All right. So let me explain my reasoning here. And we've talked about the term Grimdark, what it means so many times. Even I have done it before when I talked about like why Malazan is not Grimdark and all these other things. It's been done to death anyway. But my argument here is that the term Grimdark has lost its meaning and has lost its, necessity. And for that, I'm going to do a bit of history stuff again, right? So, all the way back in 2013... young me, well, younger me, less ancient me, was avidly following Joe Abercrombie, Lord Grimdark's blog, among other things, Things I did to, not go and study at university. And what I read there is one article. I put it down below because I think it's absolutely necessary. It's a reading that you should all go and read if you're interested in the Grimdark debate. And if you want to go deeper into it, you can also read the things that he links to. It will explain or give arguments and reasons for my argument here today. The blog post is titled The Value of Grit, in which Joe Abercrombie talks about how he has been labeled Grimdark and how some people in the field, the people that write for fantasy magazines and are for some reason or other taken seriously, back in the days, that was basically people that are now booktubers, I guess, or filled the same role as booktubers, just on a more, respectable platform. And Joe Abercrombie calls them out because they call him out, and other authors, Richard K. Morgan among others, Mark Lawrence, even Stephen Erickson gets mentioned a bunch of times in those articles if you dig deep enough, for dragging good old fantasy into the depths of grim darkness. And Joe Abercrombie explains reasonably well, really well, what he is doing and why he's doing the things he's doing and so forth. It's a fantastic article. You all should go and read it anyway. And Well, then he went and had made a Twitter account under the name Lord Grimdark, and that's sort of where we need to go with this argument. So we go back in time even further. And that is that when you look at 80s fantasy, something that sold really well, for example, is, what you might call D&D influenced, gaming influenced fantasy and all these other things. That's no problem. What is a problem, or not even a problem, like what happened also at the same time in the 80s mostly, is that another field of media, the field of movies and television, became progressively grittier. It's just, one of those art trends from like highly polished, you move over into like super grim, not super grim, but like super dark and more, independent or whatever, and you go back to like full-blown Marvel Cinematic Universe, and then you go back to more like handheld, independent production. It's how art always works. It oscillates between poles all the time. So what happens in the 80s is that cinema and television become more gritty. And by gritty, I mean they become more explicit when it comes to, well, mostly violence, because it's produced in the US and explicit sex seems still to be a big problem there for some reason. Even though y'all are super obsessed with it and how people actually do it, you just don't want it shown on, the screen, I guess. Point is, that happened in the 80s mostly. And it turned over in the 90s, and we've gone there like super far into that. Right now, when we watch movies, violence is depicted in glorious, gory splatter effects and all of that. And you know what? That's fine. It's an artistic choice. You can do whatever with it. And there will always be people who don't like it. That's also fine. That's how, art works. My argument, or my point is, however, that this movement in art, slowly, because fantasy is a small field and it's like the arse end of the literary field, basically, it took a while to actually show up there. I mean, we also have that trend in literature in general to become more explicit, to become more graphic, become more dark in a lot of ways. I mean, you can go and read Blood Meridian and stuff that Cormac McCarthy does and things like that, right? Literature also became more explicit in a lot of ways. But it took a while for it to arrive in fantasy, and the book that everyone talked about at the time being, George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones and follow-ups in The Song of Ice and Fire, obviously is an interesting, or like at least for like a mainstream discussion, a good starting point. And guess what? George R. R. Martin spent his 80s working in television. And you can see, the television effects, or like the effects of his learning in television. You can see that in the way he writes the Song of Ice and Fire books really well, especially when you go back and compare with some of the stuff he wrote before he went to Hollywood, like stuff like Windhaven or whatever, right? That's a very different George R. R. Martin writing back then. Even Fever Dream is still very different from what he does with Game of Thrones and the follow-ups, right? And guess what? Joe Abercrombie also worked in television, as far as I know. I might be confusing that, but I think he said that he worked in like in a cutting room for a while. Anyway, and you can tell that when you read Joe Abercrombie's books. He has a very visual style. His dialogue is very screen dialogue. His combat sequences, while being extremely gory, splattery, and whatnot, may not be the most realistic sword fights ever, fought out there. I'm not a fencer, I can't tell for sure, but they seem a bit over the top in that regard. But they're certainly highly cinematic and well choreographed, and you can just imagine watching them on screen somewhere, right? And that's sort of my argument. So fantasy as a whole moved towards a more explicit depiction of violence, sometimes going further and further into that direction. It also moved into like a more loose approach to language, a more contemporary approach to language, as a result of that shift in the same direction that television and cinema did before. It's just a natural process because, we all consume all kinds of art and it influences us, usually, sometimes. And that's where we were in the 2000s. And when you go and look at another aspect, like you look at someone like Stephen Erickson, who takes most of his cues from contemporary literary fiction writing, which has also gone before fantasy into the more gritty and whatnot direction with a lot of authors. As I said, it's a natural thing that happened to fantasy as a whole. Wonderful. Now, of course, there will be people who don't like that. They were there when the movies became more aggressive, more violent, and whatnot. They were there when literature did the same, and they show up when fantasy does the same. Now, there's some people in like the extreme edge of this like protest against a grittier, darker, whatever you want to call it, depiction in fantasy that do so with a conservative, religious motivation. Some of those guys started the movement called Noblebright as as an opposite to Grimdark. It went nowhere, of course, because, it doesn't go anywhere. Point is, and others are obviously just very conservative fantasy readers. They like their old fantasy and they like their art just fine, like it was 50, 60 years ago. And those people got upset with the general trend in fantasy and wrote angry articles calling it, the degeneration of the West. It's all descending into madness, cynicism, and despair. We're losing our culture. The kind of thing conservative people write. And others were more concerned about the depiction of specific violence towards minorities or marginalized groups and all of that stuff, and came from that side to it. And this is where it gets complicated and difficult, and we come to like the darker side of Grimdark, I guess. But anyway, all of these people called that trend Grimdark, and they took that label Grimdark that we have from Warhammer 40k, as said before, and applied it as a derogative term on more contemporary, darker, grittier, to use that term, more explicitly violent or explicit in the depiction of violence, fantasy, and called it really bad. And the results were as expected. Joe Abercrombie went and wrote his defense, which is a fairly well argued place. It's eloquent. You can, as I said, go and read it. And then he went and called himself Lord Grimdark because he's that kind of guy. And a lot of readers, as we all did at the time, being young, angry, and whatnot, we just took that label and ran with it. We're like, yeah, we're reading Grimdark. It's much better as your old fantasy because your old fantasy is all crap. And, you know how kids are when you're 15, you're listening to goth music and you hate everyone else because they're not as deep thinkers as you are. It is edgy behavior, and it's kind of cringy when you grow up and think about it. But that's a, an understandable reaction at the time because they called out something that we loved, that is following a more modern trend in media in general that we grew up with and that we had, seen on the screen before and all of that stuff, and tried to tell us from a fairly arrogant, elitist point of view of why it was wrong. So it felt kind of punkish to say, yeah, you know what, fuck you, Grimdark's better than your stuff, you're not getting it. And you know what? That's fine in the moment. This is sort of where my argument goes. Now, there's obviously, debates to be had about how, from certain perspectives, it's always fine to justify extreme violence against women and whatnot, as art, when it really is going into the field of, the more gamer-gatey side of things, which obviously you have like interconnections at the time out there. Once again, if you go and read the debate, you'll certainly find out about these things. And it would be bad to just ignore all of that. The point is, the label Grimdark stuck, and it was loaded with a lot of things that it really isn't. So while Grimdark was used as, by its critics at the time, to label dark fantasy that has explicit depictions of violence and sexuality, which you can do in books much more than you can do it in movies, and what is called grey morality, what is often called hopelessness, cynicism, dark humor, and, more direct, sweary, graphic language as well. And that's all it was at the time. The problem is, and this is where I'm going with why we need to stop calling it Grimdark and just drop the name, really, is that because the movement of people liking and reading and writing that stuff at the time said, no, seriously, we're not just doing that. We're doing a lot of other things as well. We're just writing contemporary fantasy fiction. That's what we're doing. And if you want to call it grimdark, then that's it. So we added all these other attributes, complex characters. There will be consequences to actions. There is hope in hopelessness. We added all of these other aspects into it, which basically became the grimdark is fantasy I like, fantasy I don't like for whatever reason, I'll just call traditional fantasy. So the whole thing shifted, and we're basically at this point, and this is my argument, at this point we are basically using grimdark as shorthand for good fantasy, and are using traditional fantasy as shorthand for stuff we don't like, under complex fantasy basically. And there's problems with that. First of all, it's wrong. Second of all, it's absolutely arrogant, and as I said, basically the level of edgy teenagers listening to goth music in the 90s. So let's start with why it is wrong. If you take these aspects, like complex characters, nuanced characters, morally grey characters, the world is not black and white. All right, let's start with that. Classics of the field. All the sword and sorcery side of things. Are those morally black and white characters? Let's look at Conan the Barbarian. Is he morally black and white? Hell no. He's very much grey. He's an existentialist, Ubermensch kind of character in a way. He just does whatever the fuck he wants. Does he kill dark wizards? Of course he does. Does he rescue women? Of course he does. Does he go and thieve? Yes, he does. Is he a pirate slaughtering, merchantmen? Of course he does. He's very much a morally grey character. Let's look at Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. Are those, morally black and white characters? Well, they go and thieve. There's even a story called The Two Greatest Thieves of Langmar, and while I urge you to read it, and it goes into very different things than you might, it only works as a title because it is implied that maybe Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse are the two biggest thieves. And there's a lot of stuff with thievery and other crimes they do. They're morally grey. Let's look at Jack Vance, another one with a Dying Earth. Kugel the Clever, one of his main heroes. What kind of character is he? Well, he goes and he tries to steal from a wizard, and he gets punished for that, and he gets kicked to the arse end of the world, and he makes his way back with the only goal to actually pay back that wizard who undeservedly actually threw him to the arse end of nowhere. Spoiler, he didn't undeservedly, he just, and he does all kinds of really mean tricks on the way. He steals, he cheats, he lies, he leaves people to die, he leaves people to all kinds of awful fates on the way there. Is that morally black and white? I doubt it. And I could, continue this until the end of nowhere. Fantasy has never been all about black and white. That's just wrong, that assumption. And if you call those things traditional fantasy, and you can't get more traditional than, 1930s sword and sorcery in that regard. I mean, yeah, you can go for Lord of the Rings, and I'm sure you can find moral ambiguity with some of the characters in Lord of the Rings as well. We just don't see them because Lord of the Rings is using the mythic term, the mythic tone and the mythic, form, where we don't talk about, morality. That's a choice that Tolkien made, and that's not necessarily something that you can see in fantasy all the time. Now, is there fantasy with really clear-cut black and white morality? Yes, it's out there. I'll pull out, once again, my favorite whipping boy there, Stephen R. Lawhead, in the Hall of the Dragon King and the Warlords of Nim. I keep forgetting the third one. My point is, that one is basically Christian allegory. Christian allegory written by a Christian who wants to get everyone to become Christian. That one is bland as fuck, and it is extremely clear-cut black and white. All the seemingly morally grey characters get all converted to Christianity, well, the fantasy version of Christianity in that world, and become good people at the end. It's boring. It's bland and boring. No one in their right mind would say that's a really well-crafted story. I mean, you can go and talk about the prose and stuff, and there's certainly reasons why Stephen R. Lawhead is, still published as an author, but It's not that the story is a good story because there's, consequences for action, characters are morally grey or anything. Those things make it a terrible book. So these things exist in traditional fantasy, but even in traditional fantasy, we're not talking about Stephen R. Lawhead and the Dragon King as one of the greats of traditional fantasy. You need to dig pretty deep to actually find that thing. There's obviously others out there. The morality in, say, like the Sword of Shannara doesn't really work well either. But the Sword of Shannara is basically, I'm only talking about the Sword of Shannara, I'm not talking about following books because it gets much better afterwards. Is basically a copy of The Lord of the Rings written by someone who did not understand what Lord of the Rings was doing. It just took the events and just fitted them into like a fantasy story that he was writing. And it's a bad book, and we know that. But those are not the bulk of traditional fantasy. Have never been. So there we have that. Morally ambiguous characters have always been a staple of fantasy. They've always been a staple of literature. Every good literature, not only fantasy. So what else do we have? Actions have consequences. Now that's one of the dumbest things you can tell. It's like every good story, no matter where you tell a story, is about actions having consequences, often unforeseen consequences that then can create conflict that you can work off and so forth. That's how it works in every good story, and that has always been the case with fantasy books as well. Once again, take Jack Vance, The Eyes of the Overworld. The action of attempting to rob a magician kicks Kugel the Clever to the arse end of the world. That is literally the end of the world there, right? It's an action. There's a consequence. Does he learn from it? Not necessarily, because there's part 2, which is called Kugel's Saga. But there certainly is action with consequence. Are there character changes? Of course there are character changes over time, even with Kugel, but not so much, because the story it's telling is something of a picaresque style of novel where like a character changing too much would actually be outside of the purview of that specific subgenre or model of story. But you can find changes in characters all over the place. I'm getting distracted here. Like actions have consequences. That was what I was talking about, right? There was one bit in Steve Talks books video, which is excellent, with like a lot of quotes and video with people talking about it. And one person's like, one of the biggest things is like, you can't be a hero with no consequences. You can't go like in Lord of the Rings and fight a big war and come home and no one has PTSD or lost a limb. And I have to sit back and wonder, like, has that person ever read Lord of the Rings? Because I remember there's this guy, you may have heard of him, it's called Frodo Baggins, and he loses a finger. I mean, now it's not a big limb, but it's a limb still. He loses a finger, and then he comes home back, and he's like, you know what? Life's not the same anymore. I can't live in this shire and see everyone be happy, because I've lost too much in the war. I have to leave. Now, is that a, hyper-realistic depiction of PTSD? Of course it's not, but the Lord of the Rings is never about hyper-realistic depictions of anything. It's myth, and it's written to be myth, and that's it. But to say there is no consequences in Lord of the Rings or other traditional fantasy is just wrong, and yeah, it doesn't work. As I said, there's once again, like character change. Do the characters in traditional fantasy change? Yes, most of them grow into supposedly better people. Some of them just go down the opposite road. Like, look at Lord of the Rings, Saruman the whatever. Over time, that guy turns into darkness, into blackness. Is it a psychologically realistic depiction of that? No, but once again, it doesn't have to be. But we have more complex character changes all over the time. Look at 1970s Chronicles of Amber. We just talked about it. Those characters change a lot over time. Is that grimdark fantasy? Of course not. It's traditional fantasy or something fantastic out there. Elric of Melniboné, he changes over time. He becomes more aware in all kinds of ways. There's so much of that stuff out there, and it's always been there. And I could continue. So when you, ad infinitum, really, So what it boils down to, and this is my final argument here, is that the only thing that makes grimdark fantasy is what those people back in like the early 2000s used to level as like criticism or just an insult at more contemporary fantasy, which had turned that way as part of a general movement in art at the time. And that is a hyper-realistic, over-the-top, sometimes over-the-top, ultra-violent depiction of graphic violence and, well, because we're talking books, also sexuality, a broader spectrum of sexuality. Yes, that's about it. More bad things happening to people. That's it. The rest has always been there. The more graphic depiction is like literally the only thing that was really, really new. Yes, more depictions of, say, homosexuality and stuff like that, but that's, once again, that's a function of societies becoming more progressive and actually acknowledging that things like homosexuality exist, which you can still find back in the 60s and 70s if you look for the right books. Even that stuff has been there before. And what we talk about when we're talking about grimdark these days is literally good fantasy, but we label it grimdark because we're still in that, like, sulky kid mode where we're like, grimdark is actually all the good stuff I like, and all the stuff that is not stuff I like, I'll just call it traditional fantasy. It's old, but we're the young kids on the block. We understand the world really. You old grown-ups don't know what it's about. That's like what's at the basis of it. And that's why I think we need to actually leave the term grimdark behind when we talk about books out here. That's it. Should we completely stop using the term grimdark? I would say in discussions, yes, but there's still room for it, and that is for publishers who want to actually market their books. Put a sticker on it, grimdark, so everyone knows it's going to be a lot of graphic violence. Kind of saves you on the trigger warnings, I guess. But that's literally the only reason where grimdark as a label has any function these days anymore, because we've moved beyond that. And all these, like, complex characters, all these things, they have always been in fantasy, in traditional fantasy. And if you don't believe me, well, maybe just go back and read some actual classics from the 70s, from the 80s, from the 60s, from the 50s. The stuff is out there. And talking just about contemporary stuff and blaming everything before, say, George R. R. Martin and calling it traditional whatever fantasy doesn't work, really. Anyway, that's my take on it. That's why I think grimdark should die, and we should actually go and talk about fantasy in other ways anymore from now on. I hope you like this. If you have opinions on it, please share them in the comments. Like, subscribe, do the wonderful things. I'd appreciate it a lot, and we can have us a discussion. I'd love to do that. Anyway, have a great day. Cheers.